If you walk through London's financial district today, you step into a place that still feels like a command center for the world economy. Glass and steel towers rise above lanes that were already old when Shakespeare was writing. In a single glance you can see the layers: medieval stone, Victorian brick, and modern skylines stacked on top of each other like chapters in the same story. And the money here is not abstract. It's tangible in the way the city moves, fast, confident, almost frictionless. Banks from every region maintain a presence. Trading floors hum behind secure doors. Legal firms, insurers, consultancies, and wealth managers orbit the same streets. In the background, invisible rivers of capital move through fiber optic cables. Deals executed in microseconds. Currencies exchanged across time zones. Contracts signed that shape industries an ocean away. London still feels like power. But buried under the polished surfaces of this city is a quieter history, one that doesn't show up in tourist brochures or heroic wartime montages. It's a story hidden in ledgers, archives, and secret memoranda. A story that helps explain why the British Empire, an empire that once controlled roughly a quarter of the Earth's land and ruled hundreds of millions of people, lost its global dominance with astonishing speed after World War II. It also explains something else: why Britain, technically on the winning side, ended the war exhausted, indebted, and diminished, while the United States, entering later, came out stronger than any nation in modern history. It explains how the center of gravity in global finance moved across the Atlantic, how London's old role as the world's banker was replaced by New York and Washington, and how the dollar overtook sterling as the planet's primary economic language. Because the version of this history most people grow up hearing is tidy. We're told that in 1940 Britain stood alone, heroic, defiant, the lone democracy resisting the darkness of Nazi Germany. We're told America then stepped in like a generous friend, sharing its strength out of principle and shared values. We're told about the special relationship, about Churchill and Roosevelt as kindred spirits, united by courage and a love of freedom. We're told it was a partnership of equals, forged in sacrifice, powered by morality and crowned by victory. It's a story Hollywood loves. It's a story classrooms repeat. It's a story designed to make the world feel simple. Good people versus evil people, courage versus tyranny, freedom versus oppression. But it's not the whole story, because it leaves out the most important part. There is another narrative running underneath the heroic one. It's colder, harder, less comfortable. It's not built around speeches and flags. It's built around invoices, collateral, and the ruthless logic of international finance. It's the story of how the United States did not merely enter the war to rescue Britain, but entered it while quietly positioning itself to inherit Britain's global role. Not through invasion, not through conquest, through transactions conducted under extreme pressure, where Britain paid for survival by selling off the accumulated wealth, influence, and future advantages of its empire. It is, in many ways, the largest transfer of wealth and power in the modern era. A shift carried out not with tanks, but with contracts, not with occupation, but with debt, not with defeat on the battlefield, but with desperation at the treasury. And the most dramatic symbol of that story, almost too cinematic to believe, is this. Britain's imperial treasure, built over centuries, was physically packed into crates, placed on ships, and sailed across U-boat-infested waters to North America. Gold bars and securities, Britain's financial lifeline, were moved out of London's vaults and locked away in Canadian and American ones, never to return in the same form. This is how a nation that had been the world's great creditor in 1914 became, by 1945, one of its most burdened debtors. This is the story of how Britain pawned its future for the right to keep fighting. And here's the twist: none of it required America to fire a single shot at Britain. This wasn't conquest. This wasn't betrayal in the melodramatic sense. It was something more chilling than that. It was leverage. The summer of desperation, 1940. To understand how big this was, you have to return to the summer of 1940, one of the darkest periods Britain ever faced. The European order collapsed with breathtaking speed. France, the ally Britain expected to anchor the continent, fell in just 6 weeks. 6 weeks. The French military, considered formidable, was broken. The Maginot Line was outflanked. Paris fell. A new French government surrendered and established a collaborationist regime at Vichy. Britain's own army in Europe barely escaped annihilation at Dunkirk. Hundreds of thousands of troops, British and French, were evacuated in a desperate, improvised operation using everything that floated. Naval vessels, civilian boats, fishing craft, private yachts. It was celebrated as a miracle, and in many ways it was. But miracles have receipts. Those soldiers came home with almost nothing. Tanks, artillery, trucks, ammunition. Vast quantities of equipment were left behind on French beaches and roads, captured by the Germans. Britain saved manpower, but lost much of the modern machinery required to fight a mechanized war. Now German forces stood on the French coast, just 21 miles from Dover. Across the Channel, the Wehrmacht looked toward Britain. Plans for invasion, Operation Sea Lion, were being studied. German aircraft scouted Britain's coastline. Officers examined maps of English roads and ports. And it wasn't an idle threat. Germany had conquered Poland, Denmark, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, and France in under a year. The momentum felt unstoppable. Britain was effectively alone. The Soviet Union was still tied to Germany by the Nazi-Soviet Pact, a cynical arrangement that gave Hitler strategic breathing room. The United States remained officially neutral. The Commonwealth dominions offered support, but they were far away, and none could match the industrial scale of America. And Britain needed everything. Rifles, because troops evacuated from Dunkirk often lacked weapons. Ammunition, artillery shells, steel, fuel, food, anti-aircraft guns, radar equipment, and above all, aircraft. Fighters to contest the Luftwaffe, bombers to strike back, and replacements fast enough to keep up with losses. The only place on Earth with the industrial capacity to supply that much that quickly was the United States, the sleeping giant with enormous factories, deep resources, and a massive population. So Winston Churchill, newly Prime Minister, turned to Franklin Roosevelt. Churchill wrote with urgency, sometimes with desperation. He warned that if Britain fell, Nazi Germany would inherit British fleets and bases, and the Western Hemisphere itself could be threatened. He framed it as not just Britain's fight but civilization's. And Churchill expected something, perhaps because of shared language, shared heritage, shared ideals, that America would help generously. But Churchill misread the situation. America was not thinking in the same emotional category. America was thinking like a country that had watched Europe explode twice in one generation and didn't want to be dragged into the blast again. Cash and carry. Neutrality with teeth. In 1940, the United States was officially neutral and determined to remain so, at least in public. Isolationism wasn't a fringe idea. It was a mainstream political force. Many Americans wanted no repeat of World War I. They remembered 1917, American soldiers sent to die in Europe. They remembered the billions lent to allies. And they remembered what happened afterward. European nations struggled to repay debts. The Great Depression poisoned international credit. The dream of a stable post-war order collapsed into extremist politics and renewed conflict. To many Americans, it felt like they'd been dragged into a European disaster and then handed the bill. So Congress had passed neutrality acts in the 1930s to prevent precisely that scenario. The most brutal element of those laws was a policy that sounded harmless: cash and carry. Here were the rules. If you were a nation at war, you could buy supplies from the United States, but you had to pay immediately in cash, in hard currency. No credit, no "we'll pay later," no sentiment, gold or dollars, and you had to transport the goods yourself. American ships wouldn't deliver them. If your vessels got sunk, that was your problem, not America's. The phrase cash and carry sounds like a store policy, but in 1940 it was a financial chokehold. For Britain, it meant one thing: survival was conditional on liquidity. No gold, no dollars, no weapons. And this is where the psychological side of the story matters, because systems don't run on feelings. They run on incentives. A shopkeeper may sympathize with a starving customer, but the shopkeeper still wants payment, not because they are evil, because they also need to survive. On the national scale, this becomes brutally impersonal. A government may speak the language of values, but its financial institutions speak the language of risk. And in 1940, Britain looked risky. Britain's hidden emergency, not bombs, but bankruptcy. Britain was wealthy, yes, but not in the way wartime purchasing required. The empire held vast assets across the world: railways, mines, plantations, infrastructure, businesses, and investments scattered across continents. London's financial world had funded trade and industry everywhere. Britain was still a titan of capital, but the problem was that much of this wealth was tied up. It wasn't sitting in a bank account ready to be wired to Detroit or Pittsburgh. It existed as long-term investments and income streams, valuable but not instantly spendable. To buy American weapons, Britain needed American dollars, and the pound sterling, under threat of invasion and defeat, did not inspire confidence. Sellers wanted hard currency, the kind that survives regime changes. So Britain began bleeding dollars at a terrifying speed. Money flowed out weekly for food, fuel, weapons, machine tools, industrial materials, everything needed to keep a nation alive under siege. Treasury officials ran the numbers and reached a conclusion that made the situation feel almost hopeless. At the current rate, Britain would run out of usable reserves within months. And once the cash ran out, the lifeline from America would stop. No cash meant no shipments. No shipments meant no ammunition, no planes, no fuel, no food. And then Britain would face an impossible choice: surrender or starve while being bombed. This wasn't dramatic speculation. It was accounting. And that is what makes the story so chilling. Britain wasn't only fighting German armies, it was fighting the mathematics of bankruptcy. It's easy to imagine war as fire and steel. It's harder to imagine war as paper, as ink, as a ledger line approaching zero. But that's what 1940 looked like inside British decision rooms: a countdown in dollars. Operation Fish, moving an empire's wealth in secret. Facing this economic cliff, Churchill's government made an extraordinary decision. They chose to convert Britain's wealth into spendable currency by physically moving it. They would gather Britain's gold reserves and negotiable securities and ship them across the Atlantic to North America, where they could be used to pay for supplies. It was a gamble so dangerous it borders on madness. If German intelligence learned that treasure ships were crossing the Atlantic, U-boats could concentrate on them. If even one went down, Britain could lose not only the ability to purchase weapons, but a major portion of its accumulated savings. This operation was given a deliberately bland code name: Operation Fish. The gold sat in the Bank of England's vaults in central London: gold coins, ingots, bars, reserves built over generations. It was unimaginably heavy. A single bar weighs around 28 pounds. Multiply that by thousands upon thousands, and you aren't just moving wealth, you're moving architecture-level weight. The gold was moved in guarded convoys and armored trains, often at night, toward western ports like Greenock in Scotland and Liverpool, chosen partly because they were harder for German bombers to reach. Crates were labeled with misleading descriptions: machine parts, fish, anything to make them seem ordinary. But the deception couldn't hide the weight. Dock equipment strained. Workers noticed. Yet secrecy held, because in wartime, loose talk could kill. Ships used for these cargoes were often fast naval vessels, warships capable of speed and defense. The point wasn't just to float across the Atlantic. The point was to outrun death. Captains received brutal orders: If capture was imminent, the ship was to be scuttled in deep water. Better the gold vanish into the Atlantic than fund Hitler's war machine. Think about that order for a moment. Imagine commanding a ship carrying a nation's savings, and being told calmly in writing, if necessary, destroy it. That's what desperation looks like. Not crying, not shouting. A sealed instruction. The Atlantic crossing. Storms, silence, and sliding gold, the North Atlantic was dangerous even in peacetime. In wartime, it became a killing ground. U-boats hunted merchant shipping. Storms could reach monstrous force, throwing waves over decks and pitching even large ships like toys. Vessels often traveled under strict radio silence, because a single transmission could reveal their location. The voyage was a strange mix of fear and discipline. High speed, low visibility, constant vigilance. And there was another danger that feels almost surreal: the cargo itself. In violent weather, some crates could shift. In extreme cases, heavy bars could slide, turning a ship's interior into a deadly pinball machine of metal and wealth. Sailors sometimes had to go below deck in darkness and chaos to resecure cargo, risking injury and death, because a shifting load could damage the ship or even compromise the hull. There's something haunting about that image. Men in steel corridors, sweating in darkness, wrestling crates not because they are greedy, but because the crates are literally the war. Secure the gold, secure the bullets. Secure the gold, secure the bread. Secure the gold, secure the right to continue existing. Then finally Halifax, Nova Scotia. Relief, yes, but still not safety. That's the key detail most people miss. This wasn't just storage. It was conversion, a pipeline of imperial wealth into American production, liquidating private wealth, the vesting of securities. Even these treasure shipments were not enough. War costs are not polite. They are relentless. So Britain escalated again, this time not by moving state assets but by compelling private citizens to surrender foreign holdings. Emergency measures required Britons with overseas securities, especially American stocks and bonds, to declare them and hand them over. In exchange, they received pounds at a fixed rate, while the government took the foreign assets and sold them for dollars. This process became known as the vesting of securities. For many families, these investments were lifetime savings, shares bought over decades, safe holdings meant to support retirement or future stability. Now the government needed them for bullets, steel, food, and engines, and the timing was brutal. Britain was a forced seller, everyone knew it. In markets, desperation is weakness. Buyers demand discounts. So British assets were often sold in a kind of financial fire sale, at prices far below what patient negotiation might have achieved. The result was not just spending, was not just sacrifice, it was transfer. Wealth accumulated over generations moved into American hands at bargain rates, because Britain could not afford to wait. And psychologically, here's what that does to a nation's mindset. It changes the internal story. Britain wasn't simply resisting Hitler. Britain was selling off its inheritance to keep resisting. That creates a very different kind of war memory, a war of pride and exhaustion, a war where survival costs identity. The American viscose case. A symbol of humiliation, one of the most painful examples involved the American Viscose Corporation, a major rayon producer and a valuable British-owned asset through Courtaulds. The company was profitable, strategically significant, and considered a jewel in Britain's overseas portfolio. But American officials, particularly Treasury figures, wanted visible proof that Britain had exhausted every option before aid could be justified politically. Under pressure, Britain effectively seized control of the asset and sold it quickly to American buyers, at a price that many British officials believed was far below its true value. The specifics can be debated in detail, but the symbolism was unmistakable. Britain was selling crown jewels at a discount to keep its war effort alive. And it wasn't just one company. Across years, Britain offloaded investments and concessions worldwide. These weren't just numbers. They were future income, future leverage, future independence. Here's a way to think about it. Imagine selling your house in a storm because you need medicine today. You survive, but you're no longer a homeowner tomorrow. That's what happens when an empire sells its assets under duress. Survival arrives, but the future is thinner. Britain's broke. The admission that changed everything by late 1940, the situation tightened again. Britain's reserves were close to exhausted. The ambassador in Washington, Lord Lothian, made a public remark that landed like a thunderclap. Paraphrased, the message was blunt. Britain was out of money. It was a shocking statement for a nation that had once been the world's financial anchor, and it was meant to stir American opinion, to create political space for a new approach. It helped open the door to Lend-Lease. But it also marked a turning point. Britain was no longer negotiating as a peer. It was negotiating as a debtor pleading with a creditor, and the psychology of that shift matters. Once you become dependent, you stop asking, "What is fair?" You start asking, "What will they allow?" That is how power works in crises, not with speeches, with options. Lend-Lease. Lifeline with strings. In 1941, Congress passed the Lend-Lease Act. In popular memory, it became the symbol of American generosity, sold through Roosevelt's famous garden hose analogy. You don't charge your neighbor for the hose while their house burns, you lend it and want it back later. It was brilliant messaging. But the real agreement was not a simple neighborly favor. It was strategic, conditional, forward-looking, designed not just to defeat Hitler, but to shape the post-war world. One major condition pushed Britain toward dismantling imperial preference, the tariff and trade system that tied the empire together economically. American leaders, committed to expanding U.S. trade access, saw imperial trade blocs as barriers. So Lend-Lease placed pressure on Britain to accept a future of freer trade on American terms. The irony was sharp. Britain was receiving the means to defend its empire while agreeing to weaken the economic structure that made the empire function. And while much military equipment was lent, other supplies created obligations and accounting trails. The United States kept careful records. Britain's argument that its suffering and sacrifice should count as payment did not translate into American Treasury language. Blood was not a currency in the ledger. If you want to understand the true emotional temperature of these negotiations, imagine two people in the same crisis seeing two different things. Britain sees a war for civilization. America sees a war and an opportunity to set the post-war rules. Neither is pure evil, neither is pure noble. But only one holds the supply line, destroyers for bases. Trading geography for time. Even before Lend-Lease fully matured, Britain had accepted an earlier deal, destroyers for bases. The U.S. transferred 50 older destroyers, many outdated and in varying condition, to Britain. In return, America received long-term rights, 99-year leases, to strategic bases across British territories in the Western Hemisphere. From Newfoundland to the Caribbean, these bases helped create the architecture of American Atlantic power. For Britain, it was a painful trade. Sovereign strategic positions exchanged for ships that were useful but hardly priceless. Yet again, the pattern repeated. Britain was a distressed seller. America was a buyer who understood leverage. And this is where the word purchased begins to feel less like a metaphor, because Britain wasn't only paying in gold. Britain was paying in territory, not by giving it away permanently like a surrender, but by leasing it in a way that effectively reshaped strategic control. For a century, that's not a wartime quick fix, that's a post-war map. The Tizard mission, selling the future in a black box. Perhaps the most consequential transfer wasn't gold or bases, it was knowledge. In 1940, Britain still led in several cutting-edge technologies: radar, jet propulsion work, proximity fuses, cryptography, and early nuclear research. These were the tools that would define the next era. Britain's leadership decided that sharing these secrets with America could accelerate production and bind the U.S. closer to Britain's survival. So they sent a mission led by Sir Henry Tizard carrying scientific crown jewels across the Atlantic in a small, unassuming container, often described as a black box, were designs, prototypes, and reports that stunned American officials. Among them was the cavity magnetron, a breakthrough component that dramatically advanced radar capability. It helped transform anti-submarine warfare and aerial detection. Jet engine research and other innovations followed. Britain was effectively paying for alliance with its future industries, handing over technologies that would later become pillars of American dominance in electronics, aviation, and defense. Again, survival now, consequences later. And here's the deep irony. Britain was fighting to protect its independence by surrendering the technological tools that would define future independence. The war economy. Britain becomes a blade, not a workshop. As the war continued, Britain became a total war economy. Factories were converted. Consumer goods vanished. Production was aimed at survival, not comfort. Ration books became normal. Clothing was repaired repeatedly. Meals were measured. Even light was controlled. Everything was sacrifice. This was necessary. It saved the nation. But it came with an invisible cost. Britain's export engine weakened. Pre-war Britain had been a major global exporter. It sold machinery, textiles, and industrial products. Those exports brought in foreign currency. They maintained economic influence. But during war, export markets don't pause. The world still buys. The world still trades. And while Britain was focused on weapons, America built weapons and expanded industrial reach. American firms filled gaps in markets where Britain used to dominate. And once those networks formed, once those contracts were signed and supply chains adjusted, they didn't vanish when the war ended. The war didn't just shift power politically. It shifted commercial habits, and habits create empires as surely as armies do. Victory, then the cutoff in 1945, the war ended. Britain celebrated, crowds in streets, relief like a physical sensation. The nation had endured and won. But in Washington, the emergency logic ended immediately. Within days of Japan's surrender in August 1945, the U.S. government abruptly ended Lend-Lease. Ships already loaded with supplies were ordered to turn back. The lifeline was cut with shocking speed. London had expected a transition period, time to convert its war economy back to civilian production, to restart exports, to regain momentum. Instead, Britain faced a sudden stop. It still imported massive quantities of food and raw materials. It needed oil. It needed timber, cotton, metals, and it had no dollars. In a moment, the victorious nation confronted an economic crisis that felt like defeat. And psychologically, imagine what that does to public mood. You survive the Blitz. You survive the submarines. You survive years of fear. You win. And then you are told, now pay, not in pride, not in medals, in currency. Keynes in Washington, a moral case meets a financial wall. Britain sent John Maynard Keynes, arguably the most famous economist alive, to negotiate assistance. Keynes believed Britain deserved not just a loan but a grant, support as recognition of sacrifice and contribution. But America's mood had shifted. War fatigue, domestic politics, and suspicion of Britain's new Labour government all played roles. The U.S. negotiators were unmoved by moral logic. They offered loans, not gifts, loans with conditions. Britain, with no alternative, accepted. Keynes returned exhausted. He died in 1946, only months later, his health worn down, his mission a painful last battle. And the symbolism is almost poetic in the darkest sense. The architect of modern economic thought ends his life not designing prosperity, but negotiating debt for a battered empire. The convertibility trap. When the pound was forced open, the loan terms included a requirement that proved disastrous. Sterling convertibility. Britain was compelled to make the pound freely convertible into dollars. On paper, it sounded like modern, open economics. In reality, it threatened the sterling area, a protected currency network built during the war. Many countries held large sterling balances from wartime transactions, but couldn't convert them. Once convertibility opened, they rushed to exchange pounds for dollars to buy American goods. The run happened exactly as feared. Britain's dollar reserves drained rapidly. Within weeks, the crisis forced Britain to suspend convertibility again. It was a public failure, an economic shock that confirmed Britain's weakened position. Here's what convertibility did psychologically. It removed Britain's ability to say, "Not yet." It forced Britain to open the gate while it was still bleeding. And once the gate is open, markets don't ask permission. They move. Markets don't care about what you deserve. Markets care about what you can sustain. Britain couldn't sustain it. The long retreat. From empire to austerity after 1947, Britain's global role became a managed withdrawal. Financial strain forced Britain to abandon commitments abroad. In early 1947, it told the U.S. it could no longer support Greece and Turkey, helping trigger the Truman Doctrine and the formal rise of America as the primary Western power. Independence accelerated across the empire. India and Pakistan gained independence in 1947, partly driven by political reality, partly by economic exhaustion. Over the next decades, the empire unraveled. At home, austerity lingered. Rationing continued long after the war. Britain endured years of scarcity even in peace, while the United States entered an era of booming consumer prosperity. Britain devalued the pound in 1949, a visible marker of decline, and the debt endured. Britain kept paying, year after year, decade after decade. The post-war financial shadow stretched so far that people born long after the war still lived under its consequences, economically, politically, culturally. And if you want one symbol to understand how far the shift had gone, look at what happens later when Britain tries to act like an old empire again. When the Suez Crisis erupts in the 1950s, Britain and France attempt a show of imperial force. And the world's response is not fear, it's financial pressure, because by then the era had changed. Britain could still fight, but it couldn't fight without permission from the new financial center. That is what the war had built, a world where power was increasingly denominated in dollars. The verdict: an empire liquidated for survival. So what really happened between 1940 and the late 1940s? A global shift. Britain did not lose the empire solely because of military defeat. It lost it because the war forced Britain to convert imperial wealth into immediate survival, and the price was paid in gold, assets, bases, markets, and technology. The United States did not steal the British Empire in a dramatic act. It didn't have to. It absorbed Britain's role through a series of exchanges where Britain had little leverage. It acquired strategic positions. It gained technological advantages. It displaced Britain in export markets. And it emerged from the war holding extraordinary financial influence and the world's most powerful currency position. By 1945, the financial center of gravity had moved. The dollar rose. Sterling fell. American military infrastructure expanded. American industry dominated the industries of the future. Britain made a morally courageous choice in 1940, to fight rather than surrender to Nazi power. Thank you for watching. If you want to understand how economies rise and fall, how wealth is created and destroyed, and what history's greatest cautionary tales teach us about our own time, make sure to subscribe. These patterns repeat, and understanding them might be the most valuable knowledge you can possess. We'll see you in the next one.